Hello and good morning. Yes, the things you learned in your first term, 10 a.m. lectures start at 10 a.m. and not at 10 past 10, right? Yeah. So, welcome to our second lecture on comparative politics in a globalized world. I'm going to get the presentation started in a second here. So as you saw in my announcement that I made yesterday, by the way, a couple of quick logistical points. So A, the slides should be available. They should be available the day before or the evening before, so you can bring them. The media hopper thing works now. So ideally, from now on, we have smooth sailing. In other words, all the lectures will be recorded and are available. So if you want to check those out, those are now there. And lastly, I've uploaded a guidance for the research briefing. So this is a kind of 4-page or so document that tells you something about what we want from you in the research briefing and sort of how you can go about it and the things that you should keep in mind while you're writing it. Because it is a task that's slightly different from essays or other sort of academic work that I've written before. But there will be time in the tutorials to discuss this, how exactly this works, and there will be a little workshop on how to write this stuff too. So, that said, what we're going to talk about today is what and how to compare. In other words, we're going to be thinking a little bit about the research design aspect of using the comparative method in our research, in our thinking about political problems. So what we're going to do today is we're going to be discussing the comparative method, the role that theory plays in how we approach things. And of course, you've already heard how important theory is. If you've paid attention in ICEB, you know that we love theory and it's what distinguishes us from, say, historians, for example, or journalists. We're going to be thinking about a couple of the elements that all theory possesses, which are normally variables and hypotheses. And we're going to be thinking about the question of how many cases do we actually need. We already know we have to compare, but do we always have to compare everything? Can we only compare a couple of cases? How are we making that kind of choice? How are we making that determination? So remember, this is basically the same definition that we had on Monday already. The key purpose of our key job when we do comparative politics is we want to identify patterns. So we don't only want to say, well, this system looks like that, and that system looks like this, but we want to say something general about, for example, proportional systems, presidential systems, systems with prosperous economies, and systems with less prosperous economies. So we want to see patterns, and we go about identifying these patterns by looking at the similarities and differences between political units, and we want to develop a theory that includes some factors that influence other factors, right? Those are all variables. We want to test hypotheses, meaning sort of statements that we can test if they're right or wrong, and we want to come up with a couple of generalizations. I think the world in general works like this. That's a generalization. So that's always our key purpose, identifying these patterns and these similarities. I mean, as I said, like if you've paid attention during ICEB, that's all that theories are doing, right? Realism, for example, is telling us that the world works in a certain way, and we see this, we can show this by identifying patterns that are sort of unchanging. You remember my example that the world worked much the same way during the Peloponnesian War as it does today. That's nothing else but saying there's a pattern here that is unchanging and that we can describe accurately with a theory. Theory also kind of helps us to identify what the actual puzzle is that we're trying to explain. Remember that in political science, what we're always looking for are puzzles, things about the world that confuse us and that we need a decent explanation for. Why are particular systems better at protecting their citizens' human rights, for example? Why do democracies tend to, in very broad terms, why are democracies better maybe at providing prosperity to their citizens? So we are trying to find puzzles in the world, questions that we want to answer, and a theory can really help us develop what the actual question here is. So a theory is nothing but a story about how the world works. That's how I've always described it. It kind of specifies that things happen in a certain way because of other things. It's nothing but that. And the way that it can help us develop a good puzzle is if we already think that we have a good story about how the world works and we find a case where that doesn't work. Say we find a state in the world that is super democratic, but for some reason their people are just dirt poor and they cannot get out of poverty. If our general story about how the world works was that democracy generally provides prosperity and is good for its citizens, what are we doing with that kind of case then? That doesn't fit our story about the world. So that's how we can use theory to kind of develop our understanding what the actual puzzle at the base of our confusion is. I put up some OECD data, for example, here. That's a nice website with all kinds of indicators where you can see the countries of the world kind of and all the variation that they show in these different indicators, their energy consumption, their educational system, their economic system, and so on. And we can ask all kinds of interesting questions, of course, how these things are related. Do you need to have, for example, a strong economy to also have a good educational system? Or do you need a strong economy, or let's put it differently, do we need a capitalist economy, for example, to have a good healthcare system? Or do we not think that? So in other words, what our story about how the world works is determines what confuses us about the world, what our open questions are. And that's what theory really does at its core. So in comparative politics, normally our theoretical approaches are quite eclectic. Eclectic means it draws from many different sources. So we're thieves, is the simpler version of putting this, meaning we like to borrow theories from all over the place. Sometimes from other political science disciplines, sometimes from other disciplines altogether, sometimes from psychology, from economy, from economics, and so on. So our approaches come from many different kind of directions. And it's led to this, it's a very varied field. On the right here, I've given you a couple of a short selection of some of the theories that exist in comparative politics that all, for example, try to explain particular aspects of the world or offer us particular explanations about the world. There's Marxism in there, for example, that of course talks about how the state is nothing but an expression of the ruling class wanting to keep things the way they are. And the state is really just sort of a servant of the economically dominant class. And that, of course, then guides our understanding of lots of other things about the political process. And there's a couple of other interesting theories in there. Some of them, of course, you will re-encounter later in the course. But so in general, you can sort of divide comparative politics theories up into sort of three very kind of broad fields. There tend to be approaches that work on the micro level. There tend to be approaches that are on the macro level, on the highest possible level, and on the meso level, somewhere in between. And this relates to what they particularly look at for their explanations of why politics works the way it does. There is an old discussion in the field, actually in other fields of political science too, about structure versus agency. How much of a role do these structures around us play? How maybe unchanging are they? How much are they guiding our behavior? And how much agency do we, individually, or maybe as collective actors, really have? How much can we determine? How much can we change over time? Or are we sort of bound to these institutional structures more or less forever? And you already hear that some of the theories you might have already heard during your studies might fall into one of these two categories, right? Theories that emphasize the structure around us and theories that emphasize how we act within that structure and how we can change it. Now, Karamani does a nice kind of categorization of the main sort of ideas, he calls it the 5 I's in comparative politics. Because I wanted to keep the slide brief, I actually went with a different sort of conception of how these political science theories can be categorized, comparative politics theories can be categorized in 3 different levels. But essentially, they talk about very much the same things. Quick little insert here. I noticed that some of you might have seen that the chapters I give for the Karamani book in the handbook seem to be slightly different from the chapters that are on the resource list. That is because the handbook is for the newer edition. And I think the numbers of the chapters have changed. So look into the handbook. The handbook is always the relevant one. Look into the handbook, see what the chapter titles are called, and find that chapter title or something similar in the one that's available online. Okay, so how does Lim divide up sort of the world of comparative politics theories? Well, he says, well, first there is approaches that kind of stress rationality. Normally, these are approaches that kind of start from an individual level. So they always look at individual actors and how they kind of act within the system. This doesn't necessarily have to mean individuals as in citizens. This can also be politicians, of course, or other kind of collective actors. Think like lobbying firms or businesses or parties or something. But they normally say that, well, if you want to understand the system, you need to understand the individual actors and why they act the way they do. Normally, it's assumed in approaches that focus on rationality that these actors are sort of self-interested. So you're not doing things out of the goodness of your heart, even when you're a politician. You're doing things because you're self-interested. In the case of politics, that often means re-election or election in the first place, or keeping your seat, or winning a motion, or however else you want to call it. So it starts from individuals, which are self-interested. They normally have a set of preferences, things that they like, things that they want, and they can rank order them. If I told you, like, would you rather succeed in your studies or have a Big Mac, you can I probably shouldn't advertise here for particular things. No, wait, Big Mac lost its trademark anyway because Supermac's an Irish fast food chain apparently challenged them in court in Europe, and now Big Mac is no longer a protected trademark. So it wasn't really advertising. If I told you to choose between those 2 things, you could rank order them, of course. You could say, well, one is much more important than the other, and the same is true for everything else that goes on in your life. Say theories based on rationality. They say that every single preference that you have, you can sort of rank order it. You can say, like, well, I'd rather have this than the other thing. And the interesting things then happen when you've understood how individuals, self-interested individuals, have preferences, and they've ordered them, and now they interact with others. Because, of course, what you want might well be dependent on what someone else wants. I want to be super strict in grading. You want to have good grades. There's going to be a collision here. Okay? Or there's going to be an interesting interaction happening in this case. So individuals that are interacting, there's where the interesting stuff happens. And normally what theories based on rationality focus on are sort of economic or social or political institutional constraints that work on you on an individual level. You don't have unlimited resources in almost all fields, so you're going to be constrained in your choices. You might not have a ton of money, you might not have a ton of influence, not a big network, and so on. Or maybe you do, and therefore you can do more things. So rational theories start from individuals that are self-interested and think about kind of the constraints that are placed on them and how they act under these constraints, and then how they interact with each other. A second sort of big field of theory are theories that are focused on structure. So if you paid attention during ISEP, this sounds a bit, for example, like the theories of liberalism or institutionalism. They focus more sort of on the rules of the game, the big structures that are on top of us, because they think, well, it might be less important what you actually want on an individual level. It might be far more important how the system works as a whole and how the system is, the rules of the system is set up, what independencies there are between different aspects of the system, and all that then leads to you being constrained by these structures. So they say, well, it's far less important what you want individually, because really what you end up doing is you just have to act the way that the kind of large overarching structures in the system really what they incentivize you to do. some of the ways in which people are sometimes unhappy with the educational system, for example, is that it funnels you into doing things a particular way, even though you might want to do things a different way, but really the system tells you, no, you have to be, I don't know, good at exams, you have to be good at writing, you can't just be good at speaking, for example. You're not going to get through a political science program by just being a great orator without being able to write a single word, right? The system whittles you down. It forces you into that mold and says, no, to get through this, to get the degree, you have to act in a certain way. And it doesn't really matter if you like that or not. So those would be theories that work on a structural level, that emphasize the importance of structure. And then lastly, there's theories that are talking about culture. They are talking about, and you might hear your bells ringing in terms of, this sounds like constructivism. These are theories that say that what you do is less based just on what you want. It's also based less on kind of the structures that constrain you. It's more sort of based on ideas, norms, values that are sort of in the system. You do things not because they always give you the best benefit, but because they're appropriate. Remember, you queue not because it's the most efficient way to go about your day. You queue because, well, it's appropriate. It's expected of you. So, and in these kinds of theories, there's sort of a mutual constitution. All the individuals together kind of determine what the structure is, and the structure then, again, constrains the individual's behavior. So there's not a hen and egg problem. Both things kind of exist next to each other. They don't say, well, first is the individual, and then they create the structure out of that, or first is the structure, and then the individuals have to adhere to that. It's sort of an in-the-middle theory, which is also why culture-based theories are normally thought of as being on the meso level, somewhere in between, right? Or theories that connect the two levels. While rationality theories are normally micro-level theories. They work on the individual level. And structural theories are on the macro level. They think about the largest possible structures that then constrain individuals. So whenever you hear about a theory here in the next couple of weeks, try to think about maybe what category it falls in here. Is it a theory that's mostly based on the micro level, on the macro level, or somewhere in between? And oftentimes that helps you connect it to other theories. And it also helps you understand quicker kind of what its main idea is. So the constituting parts of any theory, of course, are variables and hypotheses. Variables meaning factors that are either affected by something or factors that are affecting something else. And hypotheses are the things that connect these two. I think factor A determines factor B. Now, we're going to think about in the next couple of slides about how this works in comparative politics, and I'm going to give you some examples of what this can look like, of course. So here are some of the questions that you might well stumble upon when you think about the world in sort of comparative politics terms. So when we think about the dependent variable in these designs, we're always interested in what is being affected. What is the outcome that we're interested in? Now, if we look at these kinds of questions, and let's just pick one at random here. So if we pick the question 2, does money make people happy? What is our outcome variable here? What is our dependent variable? Does anyone have a suggestion? Happiness, exactly. So happiness is our outcome variable. That's what we're interested in. If we take question number 3, why are some countries democratic and others are not? What's our outcome variable? Wow, it is really 10 in the morning, isn't it? What's our outcome variable here? Yes? Democracy, right? And we can do the same kind of game, of course, with all the other questions. So in every one of these questions, we have an outcome that we're particularly interested in. Might be electoral success, might be the effectiveness of leaders, might be vote choice. Now, if we turn this around and we ask what are our independent variables, what are our factors that determine the outcome? Let's say, what would that be for question number 3? Yeah, good thing no one put their hands up because there's none in there. Right? Question 3 doesn't have a factor that we point at that affects the outcome. We're just asking why. That might include all kinds of things. Maybe it's a little bit easier, of course, in something like question 4. What's our independent variable, the thing that affects the outcome in question 4? Gender, yes, exactly. Right? So the gender of whoever we're talking about here, leaders or ministers or parliamentarians and so on. So every hypothesis or every question that we ask about the world normally has an outcome that we're interested in, and we might have a hunch about an independent variable, about a factor that influences that outcome. And some of these might maybe, I don't know, does money make people happy? That might not look like a comparative politics question, but of course, if you couch it in slightly different terms, I don't know, does economic success produce citizen satisfaction? Right? Sounds much better, right? Then you get closer to something that we might very well examine in comparative politics. And some of these other questions that I've put on the slide here are actually quite interesting and have been investigated in for a long time, sometimes without any conclusive result so far. So sometimes though, right, and this goes back to the role of theory, sometimes separating our variables from our ideas about the world can be difficult. So, of course, to come up with the question, do women make more effective leaders than men? To come up with that question, we already need to have an idea in our head that there might be, of course, a gender difference that then says something about, well, differences in effectiveness, however we measure that, or whatever we mean by that. So sometimes it's difficult to keep apart the theory itself. Gender plays a role in leadership effectiveness, and kind of our variable selection. So it pays off sometimes to separate what is sort of the abstract idea and what are the concrete variables that we're looking at. Some of these questions, by the way, we're also going to encounter in the coming lectures. For example, the vote choice question might very well come up in a lecture on political parties or elections, of course, because that's one of the key questions that we've been asking in the last decades. Does region or social class influence your vote choice more? So in other words, is a rich person, I know rich is not a social class, but anyway, does let's say does a highly educated person somewhere at the west coast of Scotland vote the same way as a highly educated person down in Sussex? Or is this a regional thing? Do people from Sussex vote a particular way and people from the west of Scotland vote a different way? And this is not, maybe even if we think that both play a role, we still aren't entirely sure how much relatively speaking, they play a role. So, now, I'm going to give you a little example, research design that I knocked together last night with a glass of wine, and I call this the happy piece. Because I want to demonstrate a little bit how variables interact with each other and how we can go about then designing further steps in the research process. So I call this the happy piece. I started with kind of a relatively simple idea. I had the idea that, well, I think whenever people's basic needs are fulfilled, they will also be happy with their political system. So this was not motivated by anything particular besides the wine. I just wanted to see, like, how can I think about kind of satisfaction with the political system, and I think this is very much has to do with kind of the pyramids of needs, and whenever your basic needs are fulfilled, you're going to be more or less okay with your system. You're not going to do anything dramatic once the system takes care of you on a basic level. So if that's our general idea about how the world works, if that's sort of our theory, how would we then move from that to an actual research design? Well, first we would have to come up with an actual hypothesis. So how can we make a testable prediction out of this particular theory? How can we make a sentence that we can then test with some real-world cases? Well, I would say if we want to make this testable, we could, for example, reformulate this as, well, I should see that countries where citizens generally are both healthy and wealthy will also be less likely to experience revolutions. Now, you notice a slight difference between my initial idea and how I formulated the hypothesis, because obviously people's basic needs, that's kind of difficult, right? What does that mean? When do you think your basic needs have been fulfilled? And I decided to be a little more precise about this and just say, well, I'm going to look at health and wealth. You can be healthy, but if you're not, you can be wealthy, but if you're not healthy, you can't really enjoy your wealth. And if you're super healthy, but you have no money, you're also not going to enjoy your life particularly much. You need both things together to actually enjoy and partake in society. And then on the other side, you see that I moved away from kind of they will be happy with their political system, and I try to come up with something that's a little more stark. And I said, well, those countries where citizens are more healthy and wealthy are less likely to experience catastrophic changes, meaning revolutions, kind of instances where the entire system is overturned. So that would be and this is a testable hypothesis already, because now, of course, I can set about finding some variables for this and actually test it with real-life data. So if we think about our independent variables here, our factors that influence other things, they are twofold, of course. I need to have some indicator that measures how wealthy people are, and one, how healthy people are. I didn't want to go to too much trouble here, so I just went with 1980 GDP per capita for wealth. If it's high, you're probably wealthy, or your state is wealthy. If it's low, you're not. And health, I measured just by the existence of a universal healthcare system. I assumed that in systems where there's universal healthcare, people are generally going to be more healthy than in other systems. Now, obviously, there's a whole host of other ways in which we could measure that, and I'm sure you can think of all kinds of things, from mortality rates to maybe infant mortality to number of sicknesses experienced over lifetime, and so on. Anyway, that's what I went with, and of course, dependent variable is also clear because I already picked 1980 GDP per capita because I was lazy and I didn't want to change the drop-down menu. I also went with, well, did a country experience a revolution since 1980? Now we come to the next important step. Now that we've settled what our testable hypothesis and what our variables are, we need to now find our cases. Because what countries are we looking at? As I said before, I'm lazy, so I'm not going to look at all countries in the world. I only looked at a handful. So which ones did I pick? I think I made an excellent pick here. I picked 4 countries around the world, namely Cuba, Haiti, Spain, and the US. I looked up what their GDP per capita was in 1980. We see that the US is the most prosperous country, followed by Spain, Cuba, and then Haiti at the bottom end. And I also looked up who had a universal healthcare system, of which Spain, of course, does have one. Cuba famously has a very good healthcare system and a universal healthcare system and a free one. And the US and Haiti both do not, for very different reasons, though, of course. It's not like the US doesn't have the money. It's just not done. Now, if that's our case selection, then we can, well, go about thinking about, well, what is our outcome variable that we're looking at? And we'll see that, well, Cuba did not experience a revolution since 1980. Spain did not. The US did not. Haiti very much did. Haiti experienced not only one revolution, they experienced no fewer than 4 in 1988, 91, 86, 88, 91, and 2004. So there's more or less a constant revolution going every few years in Haiti. And if we take these cases now and we know the variable values, we can make a wonderful little table. Every political scientist, every comparative politics person loves tables. And we can, of course, see that my theory is perfectly on point because we see that only in cases where people are neither healthy nor wealthy do we seem to see revolutions occurring. In all the other countries where only one of the conditions is given, we don't see revolutionary change. So clearly my theory of the happy piece is a brilliant one, and I was very proud of myself. I'm already writing the paper. And so we see that even with sort of a simple set of variables, we can already come up with a research design that's more or less interesting, and it explains something very important about the world, because of course understanding when and how revolutions occur is super vitally important, especially if we want to work against those conditions that foster revolutions occurring. Now you can of course say, oh, this has all kinds of weaknesses, because of course what the hell is up with my case selection? Why did I pick those cases? Why did I start in 1980? Why am I picking those variables and not others, and so on? That's all fine. I thought of that. I'll address that at some point in the future. But if we think about this in a global scale, so this is a political scientist that made something called the Satisfaction with Life Index, which is a meta-index that uses lots of other indicators, and that, much like the lecture on Monday, tries to then arrange all countries in the world along one axis, namely where people are happy, or where citizens say that they are happy. And we do see that there is a certain overlap, of course, between regions where we know that revolutions tend to occur people seem to be unhappy there, and regions where there is fairly stable systems, and those people also seem to be fairly happy. Now, there's of course one thing that, by the way, my favorite case is always Bhutan, right here, which collects data on the gross domestic product in terms of in economic terms, but also calculates something called gross national happiness, where and the goal of the state of Bhutan is to make its citizens as happy as possible, not necessarily as prosperous as possible. Anyway, it seems to work, right? At least when you ask them. So you see that there's a certain, the theory seems to work somewhat. Of course, the one major thing that I've forgotten about is, can we really be sure that the one thing causes the other? So in other words, are people unhappy and therefore they have revolutions, or do they have revolutions and therefore they're unhappy? That map doesn't tell us that. So this again is one of those things where even if we have really good data and global data too, it's not always immediately obvious in which direction we have to think about explanations for these kinds of things. So this is, of course, sort of a fictional example. If we think about real-life example about how comparative politics works, lots of comparative politics research is about voting. For obvious reasons, it's an important mechanism in democracy, maybe the most fundamental, most important one, that people are going to vote. And there's all kinds of studies that look at very different dependent variables when they investigate voting. Because obviously saying we're interested in voting doesn't mean anything yet. We need to specify what exactly it is about voting that we're interested in. Now, we could be interested in voter turnout. How many people actually turn up at the ballot box? And we could then think about, well, are we just kind of interested in the binary variable? Do people turn up or not? Do they stay at home, or do they turn up and cast their ballot? Which would be a binary measure. Or are we kind of interested in interval measures? Are we interested in this many % of people went to vote here, and far fewer number went to vote in a different kind of system or in a different kind of country? We could be thinking about vote choice. What are, not just if people are turning up, but what are they actually voting for? Or which party are they identifying with? And of course, then we would need a categorical measure, meaning have people voted Labour, Tories, SNP, Green, Lib Dem, whatever. We could also be thinking, when we think about voting in terms of the vote share that parties receive. So now we've kind of flipped this around. We're not worried about the voters and why they make their choices, but we're more worried about sort of what's the outcome? Why do certain parties receive a particular part of the vote share? And we could lastly then think on the highest possible level about the outcome of voting in terms of who actually gets to govern, who actually gets to lead the executive and lead the country. And we could, of course, then again think about this in a binary measure. Is any particular party in government or in the opposition? Or you could come up with an ordinal measure that is a little more fine-grained, that allows parties to be either in a majority government, could be in a minority government, could be in a coalition, could be the largest opposition party, the smallest opposition party, and so on. All of these are perfectly valid dependent variables that you could use in comparative politics studies, but all imply that we're asking different things about the world, that different things are puzzling us. Sometimes it's puzzling why people turn up to vote in the one country but not in the other. Sometimes we're not interested in that. We're just interested in why does a Green Party do so much better in the Nordic countries as they are, for example, in Mediterranean countries. If we then thought about independent variables, things that can explain all these different possible outcomes that we have, all these different outcomes of voting, we could, of course, come up with a huge range of things that could influence any one of these particular variables. So, for example, we could be thinking, and let's think about kind of maybe individual vote choice by voters first. So we could, of course, think about, well, do voters cast their vote based on party policies? So do people read the manifestos and they're like, well, clearly this policy is good for me, I shall vote for them. And if the next election someone else says something that works better for me, I shall vote for them. I have no further allegiance besides kind of knowing which policies are good for me. So you already can hear, by the way, the rationality theories kind of are coming through here maybe. Or do voters make their choice based on perceived competence, who they think is competent enough to lead the country? Clearly, in some recent election, that wasn't the thing that was most on people's minds. We could also, of course, think about stuff like party identification. So do people say, I am a conservative voter, and I don't really care who leads the Conservative Party, I don't really care what the particular policies are, I just know that they tend to be the ones that get me. So that's why I vote for them. You could be thinking about leadership or charisma. You could be saying, well, I think voters really vote, they don't make any kind of particularly rational assumption of anything about the parties. They are just kind of drawn into the wave of charisma that is normally being spread by whatever leading candidate there is. Not in all systems, by the way. Does the most charismatic candidate always always win the race? But still, I'm sure you've heard this from either, or you've even brought this up in discussions. I don't think party positions matter. I think it's all about like if there's a man or a woman at the front that can sort of charismatically lead the party, right? Everything else is more or less unimportant. Or you could think of campaign finance. So how much has been spent? Like, do people tend to vote for parties that actually spent the most or not? And I'm sure you could come up with another couple of things in this long list that could all explain something about voting outcomes. So, for example, one thing that's not in there is territory, region. Right? That's not in the list of things about the individual voters. So do we, for example, just believe that voters in a particular part of the country always vote the same way? Neither matters what the policy positions are, not what the parties are called, not what their leaders are, and so on. They just know I live in the country of utopia, and therefore, or in the subnational division of utopia, and therefore I should always vote for the party that caters to that. So there's a whole range of things we could look at in terms of dependent variables, and an equally large host of things we could look at in terms of independent variables if we wanted to design a study on voting. And all of these would then imply very different ways how we went about investigating this particular question. So that leads us sort of to our last methodological question. Now, we've talked about the role of theory and how it's important in framing our view of the world, and we've talked a little bit about variables and how we could choose them. We now, of course, come to the question, well, which cases are we actually looking at? After all, I've told you that, well, it's comparative politics, so we need more than one case, presumably. But how do we choose how many cases we need to look at to investigate our question? Now, the first thing we have to think about, well, comparative politics, meaning there has to be some sort of territorial scale. Is this comparing different subdivisions of the UK, for example? Is this comparing different countries? Is this comparing regions or even continents? And we also need to think about, well, how many cases do we need? Do we think it's enough to look at a single case? In most cases, it's not. But can we get away maybe with looking at 2 or 3 cases? Or do we have to look at a lot? Maybe even all the countries in the world. That was not, there we go. And I'm going to give you some examples and some actual examples from political science of how to approach these particular selection choices of maybe a single case, maybe a few cases, maybe a lot of cases. So let's start with maybe the simplest thing. You investigate only a single case. You're only interested, for example, in the British system. Now, whenever you really only look at a single setting, that's what we call a single case study. Now, it's important to note that just purely writing about how the British system works, this is what it looks like, this is how many parliamentarians there are, this is how they voted, this is how often there's elections, and so on. That's all descriptive stuff. That's not enough to make it into a comparative politics proper case study. The reasons we would still sometimes look at individual cases in comparative politics is that they could serve particular purposes. For example, they could help us generate hypotheses. So we have, I don't know, a system we haven't looked at before, or maybe a new system that has just formed, and maybe that works differently from past systems. Or maybe even the same country has changed its political system. Say it went from a monarchy to a democracy, and we can then generate hypotheses, can generate testable explanations about why things have changed, or what that change has affected. Or we could, that's a popular thing to do, for example, we could look at deviant case studies. So we could look at cases that seem to not confirm our usual way to thinking about the world. So these would be cases that are just very, very different from almost all other cases. Imagine you're looking at 50 democracies and one democracy does something wildly different. Then that's possibly enough of a reason to just look at that in isolation and work out why in the world do they do things so differently than all the other ones in the same category. One example of someone who did this pretty successfully is Aaron Leiphardt's book from 1968 called The Politics of Accommodation, and he only has a single case, namely the Netherlands. And what he's interested in is the Netherlands is kind of a unique case almost in Europe or among democracies in that they have really deep societal divisions. I don't know if you notice or if we have do we have someone from the Netherlands here? I don't know, I don't want to single you out. Anyway, there's something called in the Netherlands called pillarization, which means that there's very distinct slices of the population that are, for example, Catholic. There's other slices of the society that are Protestant, and they often come with their own societal organizations, their own schools, sometimes their own universities, and so on. So there were very deep societal divisions within the Netherlands, and they'd been that way for hundreds of years. But it was a very stable democracy. Normally, you would assume in a country that has such deep societal divisions that you would have a certain level of instability, but the Netherlands were very, very stable, and Leiphard asked, how in the world does that happen? How can they get away with people being so different and society falling apart into these very different groups, but they still have a very stable system? His answer in the book, which is actually still a really interesting book to read, is that elites played a large role. It played a role that the political system said, hey, all this divisive stuff is not going to go any longer. This is not what's taking us forward. And there were parties from different sectors of society that then merged, for example, to form parties that try to appeal to various sectors of society. So this was a very conscious effort on the elite level to overcome these societal divisions rather than exploiting them, for example, for electoral gains. Yeah, the good old times. So this is an example of a single case study that can generate really interesting explanations or interesting news stories about the world. Normally, then, if we move up one rung in the ladder from individual case studies to small n case studies, meaning case studies with a small number of cases, this is what's called a case-oriented comparison. Normally, we pick those particular cases because those are the cases that are interesting to us. We're not just drawing a random sample from all countries in the world. We're picking a few because they're interesting. And they allow us, they sit at a kind of good level because normally they give us enough space to go into quite some depth on each individual case, but still have an element in there that we're not only looking at one case, but that we can compare across cases. And we might get a lot of leverage out of knowing quite a bit about the individual cases. If all you have is like 35 pages or so to write about, it often doesn't make sense to look at 10 cases, because then all you have per case is a little paragraph. It might make more sense to look at 2 or 3 cases because you just have more space to explore the stories and the ideas that are behind these cases. So it allows us a very focused comparison. Sometimes this can be a problem, though, because if we say we're going to explain all democracies in the world, and what I looked at was Belgium, Netherlands, and Liechtenstein, probably not going to capture the entire width of the variation across the world's democracies. So it can sometimes be difficult to generalize from these cases to broader stories. One example, I don't think I put this in the reading list, but it's still a good book. It's a seminal book. It's a very important book, very widely read, is Michael Keating's Nations Against the State, in which he discusses a couple of instances in which there are clear subnational entities or territories that are trying to achieve some form of, well, let's not call it independence, but, well, no, let's say some level of independence from the nation state that is on top of them. And maybe not super surprisingly, he picked cases that were particularly prominent in this regard, meaning where the efforts to actually possibly even split off from the nation state are most advanced. And in his case, he picks Quebec, Catalonia, and Scotland. And remember, this book came out over 20 years ago, and of course this selection would be just as important, maybe even more important today, and it would still be the same countries, interestingly enough. or still, sorry, not countries, of course, still the same entities, subnational entities that he would be interested in. So this is an example of a small N case study, and in most of the lectures that we're going to have over the next couple of weeks, we're also going to often see the main research based on the topic of the week to be based on small N case studies. And then lastly, we have a large N case studies, where we just get together as many cases that we can find on that particular topic. It's normally what's called a variable-based approach, because obviously we can't say, I am interested in 123 different countries in the world and they're all great. No, we're normally interested in one particular variable. We're interested, for example, in the effect of democracy on prosperity. And we don't really care which countries we have in our selection. We just want to get as many as possible, because we are chiefly motivated by the variable and not by any particular country in there that it's super interesting to us. And in these kinds of studies, normally we go about our way in a quantitative way. So meaning we use data and statistics. Many of these things you'll re-encounter in IPTA, which you're also taking this year. Many of the things about IPTA are large N case studies. So of course, there's an advantage in that you can generalize. You can come up with large stories about how the world works really easily from these, because you already have almost all the world in your sample. But of course, you have a severe lack of depth. If you just collect kind of numbers on all countries in the world, you know very little about individual cases. But that's a trade-off that normally in these kinds of case studies we're okay with. One of the examples from comparative politics that has received, again, a lot of attention here is something called the World Values Survey. Who's come across this World Values Survey? Has anyone heard of this before? Okay, so a very select number of you. They have a pretty good website, the link I put in the bottom there, which is quite interesting to play around with, because what they do is they actually have researchers in almost every country in the world, or in a very large selection, and they all ask actual people their questions. They ask questions, for example, this is what you see on the left-hand side here, that they then these questions they group together. For example, they say that there are certain societies that are chiefly concerned with self-expression. So people think that the thing they're most kind of concerned about, or that they most want, is self-expression. So there's a fairly kind of advanced level of sort of the first world problems kind of thing. Versus there are societies where the answers of citizens imply that they're more worried about survival. Maybe not survival in the sense like I'm going to die tomorrow, but certainly it's more important to feed your children, go to school, have a prosperous life, rather than anything about sort of self-expression or the more maybe sort of airy values that we might have. And on the other axis, in this particular graph, for example, you see that they have put in the bottom are societies that are mostly led by what they call traditional values, and then at the top are societies that are mostly guided by secular rational values. Now, so in other words, this is a large N case study. They asked as many people as they could around the world what they thought about different questions, and they generated measures out of those. And they said, well, we can then arrange the world in these interesting little shapes. So we can see, for example, that particular countries all seem to share particular values, or the people in those countries seem to share particular values. So we see, maybe not very surprising, that almost all the Nordic countries seem to be in the same corner of the quadrant, in that people seem mostly worried about self-expression, and they seem mostly guided by secular rational values, while you can also interestingly go to the other side and see states that are supposedly just as secular and rational, but they are not as concerned about self-expression. And out of these measures, you can make all kinds of interesting questions, of course. One of them would be if people, of course, vote very differently in the one quadrant compared to the other, or if they turn up more when they are guided by secular rational values, or might it actually be good for voter turnout, for example, that you're a traditional society where certain things are kind of expected of you, and I don't know, going to vote is a solid norm. Or one of the other ways that you can play around with the website, for example, is you can pick particular indicators. On the right here, you see an indicator where people were asked, how important do you think is politics in your life? Or how important is politics to your life? And you can pick any number of countries that are in the study and you can compare them with each other. And one of the interesting things, for example, I felt about this more or less random selection here of China, Germany, Japan, and Tunisia is that regardless of what preconceptions you might have, the largest number of people that say that politics is not at all important to them is in Tunisia and not in any of the other countries. And one of the things that I found interesting, for example, is that the bars for Germany and China, that's the yellow and the green bars, actually track each other fairly well. So even though the systems are vastly different, of course, in a sense couldn't be more different, people on the individual level, people still seem to maybe engage with the system in a similar way. A similar number of people are certainly saying that politics is not at all important, despite their systems being vastly different. So this is an example of how you can do sort of large-scale, large N studies where you, of course, we know nothing really in detail about the case of Malta or Albania or Spain, but our goal is to kind of come up with the largest possible comparison between the most possible cases. Now, that's it already for today. I'm going to give you, I gave you a little summary. So comparative politics is normally theory-driven because we look at patterns across space and across time. In all the following lectures, you should always in the back of your mind have a little bit this question of, okay, what is the theory that's at play currently? What is its level? Is it interested in micro level, macro level, meso level explanations? What are sort of the main drivers? What are the dependent and independent variables that are being referred to here? And you're going to realize that because most science follows this same template, it makes reading studies much, much easier when you know what to look for. Now, you're actually not going to see me for another, I think, 8 or so lectures. I'm only going to come back to you in lecture 10. Next week, we're going to be having Lucy Abbott, who's giving you the first of her lectures on comparing political regimes. Thanks very much for your attention. Have a nice day.